In this video, we will learn how to copy objects. We are going to use our rectangle class, our old friend. So we have here the rectangle class, we have the width and length, we have no arc constructor, we have an arc constructor, setters, getters, and the equals method that we defined in the previous video. Now, what we want to do is to create a rectangle, all right? So let's say we're going to create a rectangle R1. So here rectangle R1 is equal to new, sorry, R1 is equal to new rectangle, and we will give it the 10 and 2 for dimensions. So here we're creating a rectangle R1, and then what we want to do is to copy R1 into R2. So here I'm going to define or to declare, so rectangle R2. All right, and what I'm going to do is to just simply say R2 is equal to R1. So what I'm hoping to do is that R1 was created as a rectangle that has dimensions length and width 10 and 2, and then I would like to create a new rectangle R2, and I have the rectangle R2 has the same dimensions as R1. So if I want to visualize what I wanted to do, so this is my intentions, this is how it would look like. So for example, here we would have our something like this, here something like this, and another one here, and let's say here this is R1, this is R2, and then when we created R1 at the beginning, so here we call it address 1, and that is pointing to a rectangle object which has a length of 10 and a width of 2, right? That's in the heap memory. And what we want to do is that hopefully R2 has an address 2, which is pointing to an object which is basically a copy of that one. So it has a length of 10, width of 2. So that's my intention when I said rectangle R2 is equal to R1. Right? Now the only thing is that this is not what is gonna happen. All right, and to understand this, why do I say that? Let's go back to the code and check what's gonna happen here. So notice here in that rectangle class that I showed you, I removed the toString method that we defined before. So this means if I go and simply say something like this, system.out.println, and I say R1 is, and then I print R1 plus, and R2 is, just a simple print message to describe R1 and R2. Now if you remember, what does it mean to put R1 and R2, which are objects, the reference variables of objects, into a system.out.println statement? So what does that mean? So if you put an object in a print statement like this, what is really going to happen is that the toString method of the object is going to be called. Now if you haven't defined that, Java is going to call the default or the given toString method, which, if you remember, is going to print the class from which this object was created at the memory hash or the memory location. So in this case here, I'm expecting to see R1 as a memory location, R2 as a memory location, and both of them are coming from rectangle class. Now, if I run this, and if what I explained here was really what happened in the memory, I would expect to have two different memories for each of them, right? So two different memory, one for each. So basically here, because they are two different objects, this is what I wanted to do. They should have different addresses, address 1, address 2. Now, if I run here, this is the one that we want to run. There we go. And this is what we get. Now notice here how this matches exactly this memory location. What does that tell you? It tells you that R2 is not a different or a copy of R1. All right. So if I go back to fix what really happened here, we would see something like this. So again, we have our stack. All right. And I would have here R1, R2, address 1, which is pointing to this, right? And that has a length of 10, width of 2. Then I go and say rectangle R2 is equal to R1, and what really happens is that the value of R1, which is address 1, gets copied in R2, the reference variable, which is this here. So what really happens is that this goes there and gets copied. So that's address 1 as well. So this means this one is going to point to the same exact object in the memory, and that's why both of them have the same address, which is the 17 whatever that is, 170DA58, 170DA58. All right, so that's exactly what is in here and in here. So this means if you do something like this, an object is equal to another object, it doesn't really get copied. The reference value is the one that gets copied. And that's why we call this kind of copying as a shallow copying. So that's a shallow copy. All right, that's not the deep copy that we wanted to create. We didn't really create another separate new entity in the memory for R2. All right, so the question is, how do we do that process? How do we make these two objects two different things? All right, and that's what we want to learn. So if we go back here, this is just the first demo showing you what I just explained. So both addresses are pointing to the same object, and you can see that by having the same memory. All right, so to copy one object into a completely new object, what you really want to do is that you want to go in the memory here. So again, let's visualize this. What you want to do is to go and have something like this. Here is the stack, here is this, and here is this. All right, something like that and something like that. All right, so this is R1, which has address 1 pointing to this object, length of 10, width of 2. Now what you really want to do is that I don't want to copy this. I want to have R2 with address 2 pointing to this. So what you're going to do to fix this issue is that you're going to create a completely new object in the memory. All right, and then you're going to take the fields one by one, copy it here. So the length becomes 10, the width becomes 2. So that's what we want to do. We want to just create a completely new separate object in the memory, and then we copy the fields one by one, and this way we create a copied entity that looks like that object. Now, to do this, it could be as simple as creating a new object, right? So here, for example, I would create rectangle R1 is equal to new rectangle 10 and 2. Then I go and use rectangle R2, which is equal to new rectangle that has no inputs, and this way I know R2 is in the memory. It has the length of 0, width of 0. And then I go and start to set the length of R2 with the value of the length from R1. So I go get the length from R1, pass it as an argument to set the length of R2. Get the width of R1, pass it as an argument for the set the width of R2. All right, so let's try to see how this would work in terms of the code. So what I could do here to create, so let's say manually copying the contents of R1 in R2. All right, so in this case here I'm going to let's comment this, and here I'm going to say rectangle R1 is equal to new rectangle 10, comma 2. Then I would go and say rectangle R2 is equal to new rectangle without any arguments. And then what I would do is that I say R2 dot set the length to be the value of R1 dot get length, and R2 dot set the width is equal to our with the value of R1 dot get the width. All right, so we know the get width doesn't take arguments and the get length doesn't take arguments. However, set length and set width needs to take an argument, and the argument is going to be a call for the method get length of R1. So this way it's going to work. All right, and now we go and do our test by printing the contents of R1, or by printing R1 and R2, which is going to be the memory, and let's see if they have this time different memories. So here, compile and run. Now you see they are two different objects in the memory. All right, so now we copied the contents of R1 successfully in R2 without any problems. All right, so that's what we achieve at this point. Two different addresses, two different objects in the memory. One thing I would like to point out is that you could actually, instead of doing R2 set, what you could do is to basically pass these arguments as you are creating the object, which is going to, in this case, call the constructor that takes arguments. All right, so something like this would save you some and here we get completely two new, because every time you run, it's get allocated a different place in the memory, and that's why we get two different locations every time. All right, so that's copying the contents manually. Now again, similar to, think about it in the terms of toString. You remember I said if you have the toString and you're going to print the string that describes a rectangle anyway, why would you do it manually instead of having a method that is in the class, and every instance is going to have a copy of this method, and whenever you want to copy, you just use it, or whenever you want to print the toString, you just use it. So the same logic we're going to use here. We are going to create a method that is called copy, and this method is going to actually do the copy for us. All right, so in this case, what we are hoping for. All right, so let's think about it this way first. What do we want to get? We want to create a copy of R1 using a copy method. Now, if you think about it, this is what we want to do. Something like this. We create R1 and then we just say R2 is basically R1.copy. So what we are saying is that we would like to create from R1, call its method copy, and create that copy and store and refer to it using R2. All right, so how do we implement this? Of course, it doesn't exist, so we go and do it right now. All right, so to do this copy method, what we want to do is to think about what does it mean to copy a method or to copy an object here. So first of all, it's going to be public so we can use it. What we are expecting it to return is a copy of a rectangle, and that's why the return data type should be a rectangle, right? And that makes sense because here what we want to do is to return a rectangle that is going to be pointed at by R2, which is of type rectangle. So now everything matches. So it's type rectangle, and we know it's called copy. And now you ask yourself, is it going to take arguments? Now, what decides is that what do you want to copy? You want to copy the contents of R1 into a new rectangle object. Now, if you want to copy the contents of R1, does the copy method have access to these contents? The answer is yes, and that's why this is not going to have arguments. Think about it similar to the get area. Get area is basically the length times the width. Now, get area has access to these contents, the width and length, and that's why we don't have to pass these as arguments. All right, now what do we want to do here? We want to return a rectangle that is a copy of R1 and of the R1 rectangle. So in this case, what we will do is that we will say return a new rectangle that has the same length and width. All right, so what that does is that it says take the length of R1, the calling object, take the width of R1, put it in a new rectangle, and return that reference as an output of this method. Now, if this confuses you, think about it this way. Temp, so I'm going to create a rectangle here called temp rectangle is equal to new rectangle that has this dot length, this dot width. Now, does that make sense to us? All right, so I'm using the current length, the current width to create a new rectangle called temp rectangle, and then I'm going to return this temp rectangle to the output. All right, again, you just created temp rectangle very temporarily, very briefly. Is going to be used just until the end of this method, and then it will get destroyed. So that's redundant. It's useless. You could just simply return that part of the return. All right, so now we have a copy method, and remember here we are going to call the copy instance method that is owned by R1, right? Which returns a reference to a new copy of the in the memory for rectangle, which is going to be referenced by R2. So copy here, and let's try to do it. There we go. R1 and R2, both of them are successfully pointing to a rectangle object, and both of them are at different locations. So that means we successfully created two separate objects in the memory with two different locations. So that's how to create a copy method. Now, one last thing that we could do also is to create a copy constructor. All right, so a constructor that as you create an object, you could just simply copy that that object from a different one, from an existing object. All right, so again, let's imagine what that would look like here, and then we go and create whatever constructor needed to do this. So I create my R1, and then what I'm going to do is to say, once I have R1, I would like R2 to be a copy of R1. Now, I know that R2, if I want to construct an R2, it has to be a new rectangle to construct something, right? Now, how do I say that this rectangle that I would like to create is a copy of R1? All right. One thing I could do is to simply pass R1 as an input. All right. And say I would like to have a rectangle, a new rectangle that looks like this one. And that is going to be referenced by R2. Now, of course, it tells you I don't have a constructor that takes a rectangle as an argument, right? That data type or that object type does not exist. So let's go to the rectangle class and let's create that new rectangle constructor. So it should look like this. So public rectangle, instead of having two arguments, it's going to take a single input of type rectangle. All right, and I'm going to call this input rectangle. All right, then what I want to do is that to take this input rectangle, all right, and I want to create the object here. All right, so the length and width, they have to match the length and width of the input rectangle. So in this case, I could do something like this. The length of the newly constructed object or rectangle is going to be equal to the input rectangle dot get length. And the width of the object that I'm creating is equal to the input rectangle dot get width. All right, so this way I'm going to get the length and width of this input rectangle and use it to set the length and width of my new rectangle. And this way I make sure that the new rectangle is a copy of the input rectangle. All right. So let's run this here. And again, I'm getting two different rectangles at this point. All right, so that's a copy method. And then I talk about how to create that copy method, right? And then we go and talk about the copy constructor, right? I called it here object2, and then I say object2 to get length, object2 to get width. And this way I just can go and write something as elegant as this and get a copy of my rectangle. So that's how to copy objects. Copying objects is more complex than copying primitive data types, because in primitive data type the value is the content of the data. And that's why if you say, for example, x is equal to 5 and then say y is equal to x, y is going to get a copy of x, which is 5, and that's simple, done. However, when it comes to objects, it's more complex because you have a reference variable that is pointing to the actual object, right? So in that case, copying can be shallow if you do just an equal sign, and that's why you need to do a more of a deep copy in one of the ways that we defined here.